Picture this. The sun blazes over the plains of Gaugamela as Alexander the Great charges toward the Persian lines. His army is exhausted, outnumbered 10 to 1. One misstep, one stray arrow, and the legend of Alexander could have ended right there. But what if it had? Imagine a world where Persia crushed the Macedonian phalanx that day. No Hellenistic empires spreading Greek culture across 3 continents. No Alexandria as the beacon of ancient learning. The very foundations of Western civilization, our philosophy, our science, even our alphabet, could have been reshaped by a single battle's alternate ending. This is the power of history's razor-thin margins. A split-second decision, a sudden storm, a messenger delayed. These tiny twists could have rewritten everything. Today, we're peeling back the layers of 25 ancient wars where victory hung by a thread. Wars where the world you know almost didn't exist. From the shores of Marathon to the walls of Constantinople, we'll explore the battles that nearly tipped the other way and the astonishing domino effects that would have followed. What if Rome had fallen to Hannibal? What if the Vikings had carved a Norse kingdom in France? What if the Tang dynasty had collapsed centuries earlier? Strap in, we're about to warp history itself, and by the end, you'll never look at the past the same way again. Don't touch that dial. The first world-changing twist starts right now. Now, let's turn the clock back even further to a moment when the fate of democracy itself teetered on the edge of a spear. The year is 490 before Common Era, and the Persian Empire, the mightiest force the world had ever seen, is poised to crush a tiny collection of rebellious Greek city-states. But on the plains of Marathon, something extraordinary happened, an upset so shocking it became legend, and yet it almost didn't. Picture the scene. The Persian army, fresh off their conquests in Ionia, outnumbers the Athenians 2 to 1. Their cavalry alone could have been a game-changer, except, curiously, they're nowhere to be seen during the battle. Historians still debate why. Some say they were reloading ships for a surprise attack on Athens. Others think the marshlands bogged them down. But what if they had charged, or worse, what if the Athenians, after sprinting nearly a mile in full armor to close the gap, had arrived too exhausted to fight? Because here's the thing, the Athenian victory wasn't just luck, it was a gamble. Their general, Miltiades, convinced them to do the unthinkable, thin their center and strengthen the wings, a move that risked collapse if the Persians pushed hard enough. But they didn't. The wings crushed inward and the Persian line shattered. Now imagine that gamble failing. The Athenian hoplites, those citizen soldiers who left their farms to fight, routed instead of victorious. Athens falls, Persia tightens its grip, and with it the experiment of democracy, barely 20 years old, is snuffed out before it can spread. Think about the ripple effect. No Athenian golden age means no Parthenon, no plays by Sophocles, no Socrates questioning everything under the sun. Even the word democracy might have faded into obscurity, just another forgotten rebel slogan. And without Athens as a counterweight, Sparta's militarized society could have dominated Greece entirely, steering its culture down a far darker path. But here's the twist that chills historians. The battle was so close, so fragile, that one eyewitness claimed the Greeks lost only 192 men, compared to Persian casualties in the thousands. That's not just a victory, that's the universe holding its breath. And when you realize how much hung in the balance that day, you start to see Marathon not just as a battle, but as the moment the modern world almost didn't happen. Next, we'll dig deeper into what a Persian Greece would have looked like and why the ideas born in Athens were far more revolutionary than anyone knew. Trust me, you won't want to miss this. Now, let's step beyond the battlefield and into the world that might have been a Greece reshaped by Persian rule. Picture a timeline where the cultural heartbeat of Athens is silenced, where the ideas that shaped Western thought never get the chance to breathe. Without that narrow victory at Marathon, the ripple effects would have been staggering, reaching far beyond politics into the very soul of human creativity. First, consider philosophy. In our reality, Athens became the cradle of thinkers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, men who questioned the nature of justice, knowledge, and existence itself. But under Persian dominance, these voices might have been extinguished before they ever spoke. The Achaemenid Empire was no stranger to intellectual achievement, but its rulers prized obedience over questioning. Persian satraps were administrators, not debaters. Free thought, the kind that thrived in Athens' agora, would have been seen as a threat. Imagine a world without the Socratic method, without the Republic's vision of justice, a world where why was a dangerous word. Then there's theatre. The plays of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides weren't just entertainment, they were the mirror Athens held up to itself, wrestling with themes of fate, power, and human frailty. Persian art, by contrast, celebrated kings and conquests. The raw, democratic clash of ideas in Greek tragedy, where heroes defy gods and commoners challenge kings, would have clashed with Persia's hierarchical worldview. No Oedipus grappling with destiny, no Antigone defying tyranny. The stage, like the Polis, would have been smaller, quieter, far less daring. And what of the Olympic Games? Founded in 776 before Common Era, the Olympics were more than athletic contests. They were a symbol of Greek unity, a temporary truce in a fractious world. Persia had no equivalent, their empire unified through force, not shared culture. Had Greece fallen, the games might have faded into obscurity, replaced by imperial spectacles glorifying a single ruler. No laurel crowns, no victors returning as heroes, just another tradition erased in the name of control. But the darkest twist lies in democracy itself. Athens' system was messy, fragile, and radical, a government where cobblers and farmers had a voice. Persia's model was the opposite, absolute power radiating from a god-king. Had Athens fallen, the experiment of self-rule might have been dismissed as a fleeting folly, not the spark that ignited centuries of political evolution. No Roman Republic inspired by Greek ideals, no Enlightenment thinkers citing Pericles. The very concept of citizens could have remained a footnote, not a foundation. Yet here's the haunting question: did Persia even realize what it nearly crushed? To them, Athens was a rebellious town, not the birthplace of ideas that would outlast empires. And that's the true weight of Marathon. It wasn't just a battle for territory, it was a battle for the future of thought itself. One charge, one moment of hesitation, and the light of the ancient world might have flickered out before it ever truly shone. Now, as we turn the page, prepare to see how another hinge of history swung on a single battle, one where an empire's ambition collided with a city's desperation, and the Mediterranean's fate hung in the balance. The siege of Syracuse awaits, and its echoes are just as profound. Stay with us. Now, let's sail across the Aegean to a clash of wills and weapons that nearly rewrote the fate of the Mediterranean. The siege of Syracuse wasn't just another campaign, it was Athens' gamble for immortality, a roll of the dice that could have kept their empire standing tall. But as we'll see, this story hinges on two wild cards: the brilliance of a rogue general and the desperation of a city fighting for its life. Picture this: Athens, at the height of its power, launches an audacious invasion of Sicily in 415 before Common Era. Their goal: to cripple Syracuse, Sparta's ally, and seize control of the island's grain and wealth. With a fleet of over 100 triremes and thousands of hoplites, victory seemed inevitable. But here's the twist: the man who championed this campaign, the charismatic Alcibiades, was playing both sides. Halfway through the expedition, he was recalled to Athens to face charges of sacrilege, and instead of surrendering, he defected to Sparta. His betrayal wasn't just personal, it was strategic gold for the enemy. He revealed Athenian weaknesses, urging Syracuse to exploit them. Now imagine if Alcibiades had stayed loyal. Without his insider knowledge, Syracuse might never have devised its devastating counter-strategies. Their general, Gylippus, fortified the city's walls with makeshift extensions, trapping the Athenians in a grinding war of attrition. But what if those defenses had been built too late? Athenian siege engines could have breached Syracuse's walls early, starving the city into submission. Worse for Syracuse, their naval tactics like luring Athenian ships into the harbor's narrow spaces relied on precise timing. A single misstep, and their entire fleet could have been crushed by Athens' superior oarsmen. And consider the domino effect. A victorious Athens would have dominated Sicilian trade routes, flooding their coffers with grain and silver. With that wealth, they could have reinforced their armies, outlasting Sparta's relentless sieges back home. The Peloponnesian War, which ultimately broke Athens, might have ended with Sparta suing for peace. No humiliating surrender, no dismantled long walls, just an Athenian empire stretching from the Black Sea to Sicily. But the real shockwave, Carthage, Syracuse's fall would have left Sicily open to Athenian influence, blocking Carthaginian expansion eastward. Rome, still a minor power at the time, might never have faced its legendary rival Hannibal centuries later. The Mediterranean's balance of power would have tilted entirely toward Athens, reshaping everything from coinage to culture. Yet history chose another path. Alcibiades' betrayal, Syracuse's grit, and a handful of pivotal battles sealed Athens' doom. The lesson here isn't just about fate, it's about how empires can be undone by the very ambition that built them. As we turn the page, another empire stands at the brink, and this time, it's not a city's survival at stake, but the destiny of continents. The Battle of Gaugamela looms, where a single king's mistake nearly cost him the world. Stay with us. Now, let's peel back the layers of what Athenian dominance in Sicily might have truly meant, not just for the warring states of Greece, but for the entire ancient world. Picture a Mediterranean where Athens, not Rome, becomes the unrivaled superpower. With Sicily under their control, the Athenians would have commanded the island's vast wheat fields, turning grain shortages into a thing of the past. No longer dependent on the Black Sea, Athens could have fed its armies indefinitely, starving Sparta of any hope to outlast them. But the ripple effects go far beyond a single war. Syracuse's fall would have sent shockwaves through Carthage, Athens' greatest rival in the west. Carthaginian traders who relied on Sicilian ports would have found their routes choked by Athenian patrols. Without access to Sicily's resources, Carthage's ambitions to expand eastward might have crumbled, leaving them too weak to challenge Rome centuries later. And here's the twist: Rome itself could have been stifled in its cradle. With Athens dominating the central Mediterranean, the young republic might never have gained the naval expertise or wealth to conquer beyond Italy. No Punic Wars, no Hannibal crossing the Alps, just an Athenian-controlled sea dictating the flow of history, but the cultural impact runs even deeper. Athenian democracy, art, and philosophy could have spread westward earlier, blending with Italic and Carthaginian traditions. Imagine Sicilian theaters staging Euripides' plays, or Athenian architects reshaping Carthage's skyline. Latin, without Rome's imperial reach, might have remained a regional dialect, while Greek became the lingua franca of Europe. Even the gods would have shifted. Athena's worship could have eclipsed Jupiter's in influence, altering the spiritual landscape of the ancient world. Yet the most startling possibility, a delayed Roman Empire might have changed Christianity's rise. Without Rome's roads to spread his teachings, would Paul the Apostle have reached as many converts? Would Constantine have legalized a faith that hadn't yet penetrated the empire's heartland? The timeline of monotheistic dominance could have stretched centuries longer, leaving pagan traditions alive across Europe. Of course, history didn't unfold this way. Athens' defeat at Syracuse left a power vacuum that Rome eventually filled. But for a moment, the fate of continents hung in the balance, not on the edge of a sword, but on the loyalty of one man and the defenses of one city. As we turn our gaze eastward, another empire teeters on the brink, where the clash of spears and the cunning of kings will decide the fate of Persia. The Battle of Gaugamela awaits, and with it, Alexander's gamble for immortality. Stay with us. Now, let's journey east to the sun-baked plains of Mesopotamia, where history nearly pivoted on the clash of steel and the roar of chariots. Here, in the year 331 before the Common Era, Alexander the Great faced his greatest test, the Battle of Gaugamela. This wasn't just a fight for territory. It was a showdown for the fate of the Persian Empire, the richest and most powerful realm the world had ever seen. Darius III, Persia's king, had learned from his crushing defeat at Issus 2 years earlier. This time he chose flat, open ground, perfect for his secret weapon scythe chariots. These weren't ordinary war carts. Their blades could slice through ranks of infantry like wheat. Darius positioned them to charge straight into Alexander's famed Macedonian phalanx, hoping to shatter its tight formation. And for a moment it almost worked. The chariots tore into the left flank, carving gaps in the line. If Darius had committed his reserves then, history might remember this day as his triumph. But Alexander was no ordinary commander. Seeing the chaos, he didn't panic. Instead, he lured the Persians into overextending, creating a fatal gap in their own lines. Then came his masterstroke. Leading his elite companion cavalry, he drove straight for Darius himself. The Persian king, witnessing the Macedonian spears closing in, chose flight over fight, abandoning his army to its fate. Yet Alexander's victory wasn't without heart-stopping close calls. A Persian nobleman's axe nearly split his helmet, leaving him dazed. Had that blow landed an inch lower, the legend of Alexander would have ended in the dust of Gaugamela. What if Darius had held his nerve? If those chariots had broken through, scattering the phalanx like kindling? Persia's empire could have endured, its vast bureaucracy and roads keeping the East unified for centuries. Without Alexander's conquests, there'd be no Alexandria, no Hellenistic cities dotting the map from Egypt to India. Greek ideas, from democracy to geometry, might never have fused with Persian and Eastern traditions. The Silk Road, shaped by Greek-influenced kingdoms, could have taken a radically different path. Even religion might have diverged. Zoroastrianism, not Christianity, might have become the dominant faith of the Mediterranean world. Yet Gaugamela's true lesson lies in its fragility. History hinged on a single charge, a king's split-second decision, and a near-fatal axe swing. As we'll see next, the echoes of this battle would ripple far beyond Persia, shaping cultures and empires in ways no one could have predicted. The world after Alexander would never be the same, but how different might it have been? That question lingers as we turn to the aftermath of his conquests, where the seeds of a new era were sown. Now, let's step into the shadow of what might have been a world where Persia's triumph at Gaugamela reshaped the cultural fabric of Eurasia. Without Alexander's conquests, the vibrant fusion of Greek thought with Eastern traditions might never have happened, leaving Hellenism stillborn in its cradle. Imagine a map without the glittering network of Alexandrias, those cities that became beacons of learning and trade. The great library of Alexandria, home to Euclid's geometry and Archimedes' inventions, might never have risen from the sands. Scientific progress could have stalled, with Persian scholars favoring practical astronomy over Greek theoretical pursuits, delaying breakthroughs like Aristarchus' heliocentric model by centuries. Art and architecture would have taken a starkly different path. The flowing drapery of Greek sculpture, the balanced proportions of the Parthenon, these might have remained confined to the Aegean, overshadowed by Persia's grand but rigid imperial style. The lifelike realism of Hellenistic art, which later inspired Rome's masterpieces, could have been lost, leaving history without the expressive faces of the Venus de Milo or the Laocoon. Even language would have diverged. Koine Greek, the lingua franca of the ancient world, might never have spread, leaving Aramaic or Old Persian as the dominant tongues. The New Testament, written in Greek, could have been composed in another script, altering the very texture of Christianity's early spread. Religion, too, would have transformed. Zoroastrianism, with its dualistic vision of cosmic struggle, might have filled the spiritual vacuum left by Greece's diminished influence. Without Hellenistic syncretism, the gods of Olympus wouldn't have mingled with Egyptian or Mesopotamian deities, and figures like Serapis, a blend of Osiris and Zeus, might never have emerged. Even the rise of Christianity could have been delayed or redirected, as its early theologians drew heavily on Greek philosophy to articulate concepts like the Logos. Trade routes tell another tale. The Silk Road flourished under Hellenistic kingdoms like the Seleucids, who bridged east and west. Without them, the exchange of silk, spices, and ideas might have been far slower, with Persia's centralized control prioritizing stability over exploration. The Chinese, who first encountered the West through Greek-influenced Bactria, might have viewed Europe as a distant, barbaric fringe rather than a land of philosophical innovation. Yet the most profound loss could be intangible: the spirit of questioning that Greek culture nurtured. From Socrates' dialogues to Aristotle's empiricism, this tradition laid the groundwork for the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. In a Persian-dominated world where kings ruled as divinely ordained autocrats, would democracy have found fertile soil? Would the scientific method have taken root without the Greek obsession with underlying principles? The answers here are murky, but one thing is clear: the absence of Hellenism would have left our intellectual heritage immeasurably poorer. As we reflect on these threads of possibility, we're reminded how fragile the tapestry of history truly is. A single battle's twist could have unwound centuries of cultural exchange, leaving us in a world both familiar and strangely alien. And with that thought, we turn next to the clash of empires in the Western Mediterranean, where Carthage's legendary general Hannibal came within a hair's breadth of rewriting Rome's destiny. Now, shifting our gaze across the Mediterranean, we arrive at one of history's most tantalizing what-ifs: the moment Hannibal Barca stood poised to crush Rome at the Battle of Cannae. Picture this: it's the summer of 216 BCE, and the Carthaginian general, with his army of hardened mercenaries and war elephants, has already crossed the Alps in a daring march that stunned the Romans. At Cannae, he lures a massive Roman force into a trap, enveloping them with a brilliant pincer movement. The result, one of the deadliest single-day battles in ancient history, with nearly 70,000 Romans slaughtered. Yet, despite this crushing victory, Hannibal hesitates. He doesn't march on Rome itself, a decision historians still debate. But what if he had? The logistical hurdles were immense. Hannibal's army was far from home, cut off from steady supplies. His legendary war elephants, decimated by the Alpine crossing, were now more symbolic than strategic. Carthage's Senate, riddled with political rivals, offered lukewarm support, refusing to send reinforcements or siege engines. Meanwhile, Rome's alliances across Italy held firm, allowing them to raise new legions with astonishing speed. Hannibal's gamble relied on Italian cities defecting to his side, but most stayed loyal, leaving him stranded in hostile territory. Yet, suppose just a few key details had shifted. If Hannibal had siege equipment to assault Rome's walls, or if Carthage had sent a fleet to blockade the Tiber, the city might have fallen. A Roman surrender would have reshaped the Mediterranean overnight. Carthage, not Rome, would dominate trade routes from Spain to Egypt. Their merchant-driven economy, focused on commerce rather than conquest, might have created a less centralized, more cosmopolitan empire. Imagine Carthaginian coinage circulating from Gibraltar to Tyre, their goddess Tanit worshipped alongside local deities in a patchwork of cultural exchange. The ripple effects would be profound. Rome's legal system, which underpins so many modern governments, might never have developed. Instead, Carthage's emphasis on contracts and maritime law could have become the foundation of Western jurisprudence. Latin, the ancestor of so many languages, might have remained a regional dialect, while Punic, a Phoenician dialect, became the lingua franca. Even Christianity's spread could have differed. Without Rome's roads and administrative reach, the faith might have remained a Middle Eastern sect rather than a global religion. But perhaps the most striking change would be in warfare itself. Rome's rise popularized the legion, a flexible, disciplined force that became the model for armies worldwide. Carthage, relying on mercenaries and naval prowess, might never have standardized land warfare in the same way. Future conflicts could have seen less emphasis on infantry and more on naval dominance, altering the trajectory of military history. As we ponder these possibilities, we're left with a humbling truth. History's turning points often hinge on fragile logistics and split-second decisions. Hannibal's story reminds us that even genius can be thwarted by circumstance. And with that, we turn next to the dense forests of Germania, where another empire's fate hung in the balance. Now, let's venture deeper into this alternate world where Carthage, not Rome, emerged as the Mediterranean superpower. Picture a reality where Carthaginian galleys, not Roman roads, became the arteries of empire. Their mastery of trade and seafaring would have reshaped Europe's very foundations, starting with law. Unlike Rome's rigid 12 tables, Carthage's legal system was built on maritime contracts and commercial disputes, prioritizing flexibility over conquest. Imagine a Europe where business agreements, not territorial expansion, drove legal innovation. Merchant courts might have standardized early banking practices, laying the groundwork for modern finance centuries earlier. Religion, too, would have taken a different path. Carthage's pantheon, led by Baal, Hammon, and Tanit, blended Phoenician traditions with local beliefs, a stark contrast to Rome's state-controlled cults. Without Rome's persecution of competing faiths, Christianity might never have needed the Emperor Constantine's embrace to survive. Instead, the Mediterranean could have remained a mosaic of decentralized cults, from Egyptian Isis worship to Carthage's childless sacrificial rites. The very concept of a state religion might never have taken hold, leaving spiritual practices fluid and regional. Navigation would have been Carthage's crown jewel. Their explorers, like Hanno the Navigator, already charted the African coast past the Sahara. With empire-scale resources, Carthage might have sponsored voyages beyond Gibraltar centuries before the Vikings. Picture Punic traders reaching Britain's tin mines or even the Baltic amber routes, creating a trans-European trade network without Roman intermediaries. Their star-based navigation techniques, later lost to Europe, could have accelerated global exploration, potentially connecting with Silk Road caravans from the east. Even daily life would feel unfamiliar. Latin's structured grammar, which shaped Romance languages, might have been overshadowed by Punic's Semitic roots. Words like admiral, from Arabic Amir al-Bahr, ironically via Carthage's Phoenician cousins, could have entered European vocabularies earlier. Urban design, too, would reflect Carthage's focus on harbors over forums. Coastal cities like Barcelona or Naples might have risen as trade hubs under Carthaginian planning, their grids optimized for warehouses, not temples. Yet the starkest difference, warfare. Rome's legions forged a template of discipline and standardization that influenced armies from Napoleon to NATO. Carthage, reliant on diverse mercenary bands, might have left military science fragmented. Future generals could have prized adaptability over uniformity, with navies, not infantry, deciding empires' fates. The age of exploration might have arrived sooner, but the art of ground combat could have remained an eclectic, localized craft. As we pull back from this vision, one thread binds these possibilities. Carthage's legacy would have been one of connections, not conquest. Their world might have been less centralized, more pluralistic, a tapestry of trade routes and treaties rather than aqueducts and absolute rule. And with that, we cross the Rhine into Germania, where the absence of a single battle reshaped an entire continent's destiny. But now, let's journey north to the dense, mist-shrouded forests of Germania, where a single ambush altered the fate of Europe. Imagine a world where Rome's legions didn't meet their doom in the Teutoburg forest, where 3 entire divisions vanished in a storm of arrows and Germanic war cries. This wasn't just a battle, it was a turning point that could have rewritten the map of the continent. The the stage was set in the year 9 of the Common Era. Publius Quinctilius Varus, a Roman governor more accustomed to court politics than wilderness warfare, led his troops deep into Germania, convinced the region was ripe for full annexation. But Varus fatally misjudged his allies. Arminius, a Germanic chieftain raised in Rome as a hostage, had secretly united fractured tribes for a rebellion. His knowledge of Roman tactics turned their greatest strength, discipline, into a lethal weakness. The narrow forest paths neutralized the legion's formations, while relentless rain turned the ground to sludge, bogging down their heavy armor. Yet what if Varus had heeded warnings about Arminius' betrayal, or if the skies had cleared, allowing Rome's cavalry to maneuver? A single scout's alert or a shift in the weather could have spared the legions, enabling them to crush the rebellion and secure Germania as a province. With the region under Roman control, the empire's borders might have stretched to the Elbe River, creating a shorter, more defensible frontier. The Rhine would no longer mark the edge of civilization but its heartland. Romanization would have followed. Germanic tribes, like the Gauls before them, might have adopted Latin, built amphitheaters, and connected to Rome's road network. Cities like Cologne, already a Roman outpost, could have flourished as regional capitals rather than frontier garrisons. The cultural divide between civilized Rome and barbarian Germania might have blurred, preventing the later stereotypes that fueled centuries of conflict. Most crucially, Rome's grip on Germania could have stabilized its northern borders, reducing the need for constant military campaigns. Fewer troops tied down in the north might have allowed the empire to focus on crises elsewhere, potentially delaying its eventual collapse. The migrations that reshaped Europe, like the later invasions by the Goths and Vandals, could have been redirected or absorbed. But without the Teutoburg disaster, would Rome's overextension have accelerated instead? A larger empire might have strained resources further, hastening decline. Or perhaps Germania's resources, its iron, timber, and manpower, would have bolstered Rome for centuries. The ripple effects are endless, but one thing is certain: Europe's identity hung in the balance beneath those ancient oaks. As we leave the fog of Germania behind, another empire teeters on the brink in distant China, where rebellion threatens to shatter a golden age. Shifting eastward to an alternate timeline where Rome held Germania, let's explore how this could have reshaped Europe's destiny. Picture a world where the legions marched triumphantly back to the Rhine, leaving behind not graves but garrisons. With Germania firmly under Roman control, the empire's northern frontier would have transformed from a bleeding wound into a fortified shield. The first and most immediate change would have been military. A Roman Germania stretching to the Elbe River would have created a shorter, more defensible border. Instead of pouring endless resources into policing the Rhine, Rome could have stationed fewer troops along a consolidated frontier, freeing up legions to quell rebellions or repel invasions elsewhere. Imagine the impact during crises like the Punic Wars. Instead of scrambling to defend Italy from Germanic raids, Rome might have preemptively crushed threats in Germania's deep forests before they reached the Alps. But the real revolution would have been cultural. Rome didn't just conquer, it assimilated. Just as Gaul became a heartland of Latin learning and olive groves, Germania might have evolved into a network of bustling Roman towns. Germanic tribes, gradually adopting togas and tax collectors, could have contributed fresh manpower to the legions rather than raiding them. Cities like Berlin or Hamburg might have arisen centuries earlier as Roman trading hubs, their streets lined with temples to Jupiter instead of later medieval churches. Latin, not Germanic dialects, could have become the language of law and literature east of the Rhine, erasing the linguistic divide that later split Europe. Economically, Germania's vast forests and iron deposits would have been a boon. Rome's insatiable appetite for resources could have been met by Germanic mines and timber, fueling everything from shipbuilding to aqueducts. The Amber Road, an ancient trade route, might have been secured earlier, funneling Baltic wealth directly into Roman coffers. With Germania stabilized, the chaotic migrations that later toppled the empire, like the Gothic floods, could have been absorbed or diverted, buying Rome precious decades or even centuries. Yet integration wasn't without risks. Overextending into Germania might have strained Rome's administrative machinery, repeating the mistakes of overexpansion that plagued other frontiers. Would Germanic legions, like their Illyrian counterparts, have eventually seized the imperial purple, accelerating political fractures, or would their loyalty, forged through shared citizenship, have strengthened the empire? The ethnic map of Europe would look unrecognizable. Without the Teutoburg disaster, the Germanic tribes might never have coalesced into the kingdoms that birthed modern Germany, Scandinavia, or England. The Anglo-Saxon migrations to Britain could have been a trickle rather than a wave, leaving Celtic languages dominant. Even the Huns' later rampage might have met stiffer resistance from a Romanized Germania, altering Attila's destructive path. As we ponder these threads of history, another seismic shift was unfolding far to the east, where a rebellion threatened to fracture the world's mightiest empire. Turning our gaze to the Far East, we arrive at a pivotal moment that nearly unraveled one of history's greatest empires. The Lushan Rebellion wasn't just another uprising. It was a perfect storm of betrayal, ambition, and imperial overreach that brought the mighty Tang dynasty to its knees. Imagine if the rebel general Lushan had succeeded in his boldest move, capturing Chang'an, the glittering capital often called the Rome of Asia. The fallout would have reshaped China's destiny in ways we can barely comprehend. At its core, this conflict was a masterclass in failed trust. Lushan, a favored general of Emperor Xuanzong, commanded nearly 200,000 troops along the northern frontier, equivalent to 1/3 of the entire Tang military. His rapid promotion through the ranks should have been a warning sign. The emperor, distracted by palace intrigues and his famous consort Yong Gaifai, failed to see the danger until rebel banners were already flying. The logistics alone were staggering, and Lushan's forces had to coordinate movements across thousands of miles while crossing the Yellow River during winter, a feat comparable to Hannibal crossing the Alps. What made this rebellion uniquely devastating was its timing. The Tang dynasty had expanded too far, too fast. Their famed equal field system of land distribution was collapsing under population pressure, while military governors like Lushan gained frightening autonomy. When the rebellion erupted, it exposed the empire's rotten core. Provinces that should have rallied to the emperor instead hesitated or switched sides. The capital's fall wasn't inevitable, but when Chang'an's gates were opened by defectors in 756, it revealed a terrifying truth. The Tang weren't just fighting rebels, they were battling their own administrative failures. Consider the economic carnage. Chang'an wasn't just a political center, it was the eastern terminus of the Silk Road, a melting pot of Persian, Sogdian, and Central Asian traders. Its sacking would have shattered international confidence, potentially redirecting commerce south to emerging seaports centuries before the Song dynasty's maritime boom. The census records tell the grim story. China's population plummeted from about 50 million to just 30 million during the rebellion's 8-year span. Fields lay fallow, canals silted up, and the Grand Canal, China's economic aorta, was repeatedly cut by rebel forces. The cultural implications run even deeper. Tang China was experiencing a golden age of poetry, with luminaries like Lai Bai and Du Fu composing masterpieces. A rebel victory might have extinguished this renaissance, just as Athens' defeat could have silenced Socrates. Buddhism, which flourished under Tang patronage, might have faced brutal suppression, and Lushan promoted himself as a champion of anti-Buddhist sentiment. Even tea culture, which became a national ritual during this era, could have vanished from elite circles if the rebellion had shattered the intricate social structures that nurtured such traditions. Yet the most fascinating what-ifs concern China's territorial integrity. The Tang dynasty eventually defeated the rebellion, but at terrible cost, granting warlords unprecedented power that led to the Five Dynasties period. Had an Lushan won, China might have fractured into competing states like post-Roman Europe, with no central authority to maintain the Great Wall or administer the imperial exams. The later Jin's disastrous decision to cede the 16 prefectures to the Khitans in 937, which haunted China for centuries, might have occurred 200 years earlier, giving steppe nomads permanent footholds south of the Yellow River. As dust settled on this near collapse, another empire faced its own existential crisis, one where wind and wave would decide the fate of an island nation. Now let's journey deeper into the ripple effects of a fractured China. Had the Lushan Rebellion succeeded in permanently splintering the Tang Empire, the consequences for technological progress would have been staggering. Consider gunpowder, one of humanity's most transformative inventions. Under the Tang, alchemists experimenting with saltpeter mixtures first documented its explosive properties in the 9th century. But without a unified imperial court funding military research, these early breakthroughs might never have evolved beyond laboratory curiosities. Regional warlords preoccupied with survival would lack resources to refine gunpowder into weapons, potentially delaying its battlefield dominance by centuries. Imagine Mongol armies encountering fortified European castles without cannons, or Christopher Columbus sailing without fireworks signaling his arrival in the New World. The printing revolution faced similar risks. While block printing emerged during the Tang, it was the centralized bureaucracy that mass-produced administrative manuals, Buddhist texts, and classic literature. A divided China would lack the standardized written language and distribution networks that made movable type practical when it appeared during the Song dynasty. Scholar officials, traditionally recruited through empire-wide exams, might have retreated to local dialects, fracturing the literary culture that enabled mass literacy. We could have seen a world where knowledge moved as slowly as it did in medieval Europe, with hand-copied manuscripts remaining the norm. The ripple effects are mind-bending. Would the Renaissance have flourished without paper-making technology spreading westward? Would the Protestant Reformation have lacked printed Bibles to fuel its fire? Even seemingly mundane innovations would falter. The Tang's unified infrastructure enabled advancements like standardized seed drills and iron plows that boosted agricultural yield. In a balkanized China, competing states might hoard such technologies as military secrets, stalling productivity. The Grand Canal's maintenance, critical for transporting grain, would suffer without central coordination, potentially triggering famines that destabilized regions for generations. Porcelain production, another Tang specialty, required vast kiln complexes and trade networks that fragmentary states couldn't sustain at scale. Europe might have waited much longer for its prized China imports, altering artistic traditions from Delft to Dresden. The geopolitical landscape would shift just as dramatically. With no strong Tang to balance them, the Tibetan Empire might have expanded into Sichuan's fertile basin, while the Uyghur Khaganate could have permanently annexed the northwest. Korea's Silla dynasty, which modeled itself on Tang governance, might have developed a more insular culture without Chinese influence. Most crucially, the vacuum could have invited earlier conquests by the Khitans or Jurchen steppe peoples who historically capitalized on Chinese weakness. Instead of the Song dynasty's economic golden age, we might have seen a Dark Ages scenario where constant warfare erased cultural memory, much like Europe's loss of Roman engineering knowledge. This fragmentation could have reshaped spirituality too. Tang Buddhism's syncretism, blending Indian doctrines with Taoist concepts, relied on imperial patronage and safe pilgrimage routes. Sectarian violence between rebel-held and loyalist regions might have strangled this cross-pollination, leaving Japanese Zen or Vietnamese Mahayana Buddhism to develop in isolation. Even Confucianism, the glue of Chinese bureaucracy, would face existential challenges without nationwide exams to standardize its teachings. Picture a scenario where Neo-Confucian philosophers like Zhu Zai wrote only for provincial courts, their ideas never coalescing into the unifying philosophy that shaped East Asia until modern times. As we pull back from this alternate timeline, remember that China's eventual reunification after the Tang collapse wasn't guaranteed. It took the visionary Song emperors to recentralize power, proving that even the greatest civilizations hang by threads. And speaking of fragile balances, our next chapter takes us to a very different battleground where Frankish steel would decide whether Europe prayed in churches or mosques. Now let's turn our attention to a pivotal clash that shaped the religious and cultural destiny of Europe, the Battle of Tours in 732. Picture this: the Umayyad Caliphate's forces, having swept across North Africa and Iberia, now push north into Frankish territory, their cavalry famed for speed and ferocity. At stake is nothing less than the survival of Christian Europe. The Frankish commander Charles Martel faced overwhelming odds. His infantry relied on the shield wall, a defensive formation where tightly packed warriors locked their shields to repel cavalry charges. But this tactic had vulnerabilities. The Umayyads' armored horsemen, wielding curved swords and lances, could exploit gaps in the line or feint attacks to disrupt cohesion. Worse, Frankish troops were often levied farmers, lacking the professional training of Umayyad soldiers. Had Martel fallen early in the battle, panic could have shattered his army, opening Gaul to invasion. Consider the immediate consequences. With the Franks defeated, the Umayyads might have established emirates along the Loire River, mirroring their Iberian strongholds. Cities like Paris and Orleans could have become centers of Islamic learning, their cathedrals repurposed as mosques. Latin, already fading, might have been supplanted by Arabic as the language of scholarship, altering the trajectory of European literature and law. The long-term cultural shifts would be profound. Without Frankish resistance, Muslim forces might have pressed into Germany, encountering the fractured Saxon tribes. Unlike the centralized Franks, these decentralized groups would struggle to mount a unified defense, potentially accelerating Islamic expansion. The papacy, bereft of Frankish protection after their alliance with Martel, could have been isolated, diminishing the Vatican's influence over European politics. Imagine a world where the Crusades never occurred because Christian Europe lacked the military cohesion to launch them. Technological exchange would also unfold differently. While the Umayyads excelled in medicine, astronomy, and architecture, their European territories might have remained peripheral to the Caliphate's intellectual hubs like Damascus and Baghdad. Key innovations such as paper mills or astrolabes could have trickled into Europe more slowly without the Carolingian Renaissance's momentum. Conversely, European metallurgy and shipbuilding techniques might have enriched Islamic naval power, reshaping Mediterranean trade. Religiously, the balance would shift dramatically. Christianity, confined to Britain and Scandinavia, might have evolved into a regional faith rather than a continental force. Gothic art and Gregorian chants, products of monastic traditions under Frankish patronage, could have been stillborn. Meanwhile, Islamic scholars in Europe might have accelerated the translation of Greek philosophy, bypassing the Latin middlemen who later sparked the Renaissance. As we reflect on this crossroads, remember Martel's victory wasn't inevitable. His triumph relied on terrain, discipline, and luck factors that could easily have tipped the other way. And this brings us to another fragile empire facing an existential threat, where Norse longships nearly rewrote the fate of France itself. Now let's explore a world where the Umayyad Caliphate's influence stretched deep into Francia, reshaping the very fabric of European civilization. Picture Paris not with its Gothic cathedrals, but adorned with the geometric patterns and towering minarets of Islamic architecture. The grand mosques of Cordoba and Damascus would have found their northern counterparts, their horseshoe arches and intricate mosaics transforming the skyline. Romanesque and Gothic styles, born from Christian Europe's unique aesthetic, might never have emerged. Instead, the fusion of Umayyad and local Frankish designs could have given rise to a wholly new architectural language, one blending limestone vaults with luminous tilework where calligraphy adorned public spaces instead of stained glass. Language, too, would have danced to a different rhythm. Arabic, the tongue of administration and high culture in the Umayyad world, could have gradually supplanted Latin as the lingua franca of the educated elite. Imagine legal decrees issued in flowing Arabic script or poetry echoing the casidas of Al-Andalus in the markets of Lyon. Old French, still in its infancy, might have absorbed thousands of Arabic loanwords, much as Spanish did historically, words like algebra and alchemy entering the lexicon centuries earlier. Even place names could have shifted. Paris might have become Baris, echoing the Arabic pronunciation, just as Hispania became Al-Andalus. The scientific landscape would have been equally transformed. While Europe languished in its so-called Dark Ages, the Islamic world was preserving and expanding upon Greek and Persian knowledge. With Umayyad courts established in Francia, scholars in Toulouse or Reims could have accessed translated works of Aristotle, Ptolemy, and Hippocrates far earlier than in our timeline. The great libraries of Damascus might have seeded satellite academies in the north, accelerating Europe's exposure to advances in medicine, astronomy, and mathematics. Picture Frankish scholars debating Avicenna's medical texts or using astrolabes to map the stars' innovations that historically took centuries to diffuse from Iberia. Yet this cultural exchange wouldn't have been one-sided. The Franks' mastery of heavy cavalry and ironworking might have influenced Umayyad military tactics, leading to hybrid forces blending Arab mobility with Frankish armor. Meanwhile, Europe's dense forests and colder climate could have spurred adaptations in Islamic agriculture, with new crops and irrigation techniques spreading southward. Religious practice would have evolved in unexpected ways. Christianity, though marginalized, might have persisted in pockets, absorbing Islamic influences much as Coptic Christianity did in Egypt. Monasteries could have become centers of interfaith dialogue, preserving Latin liturgy while adopting Arabic annotations. Conversely, Islamic practices might have incorporated local Frankish traditions, creating a unique European flavor of Islam, one where the call to prayer echoed over vineyards instead of deserts. This alternate Europe wouldn't just be a carbon copy of the Islamic East. It would be a mosaic, a place where the Meuse River met the Tigris in trade and thought, where troubadours sang verses blending Arabic meters with Frankish epic poetry. The Renaissance, when it came, might have sprung from this fusion, bypassing the need to rediscover Greek thought through Arabic intermediaries. As we step back from this vision, remember how fragile the historical balance was. A single battle's outcome didn't just alter borders, it rewrote the script of culture itself. And that brings us to another turning point, where the fate of an empire hung not on a clash of armies, but on the cunning of a single Norse chieftain and the gold that bought a city's survival. Now let's turn our gaze to the icy waters of the Seine, where the fate of Paris and perhaps all of Francia hung in the balance during that fateful spring of 845. Imagine if the Viking longships, led by the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, hadn't settled for silver and spices but had instead unleashed their full fury on the city. The Carolingian Empire, already straining under internal divisions, might have shattered like a dropped goblet at a feast. Ragnar's tactics were as shrewd as they were brutal. His fleet of over 120 ships bypassed the city's river defenses by dragging their vessels overland past the fortified bridges, a move as audacious as it was unexpected. Had his warriors chosen to torch Paris rather than negotiate, the flames wouldn't just have consumed wooden houses, they might have incinerated the very heart of Frankish power. With a royal treasury and relics like Saint Genevieve's bones lost to the inferno, Charles the Bald's authority could have crumbled faster than a charcoal husk. The ransom itself was a masterclass in psychological warfare. 7,000 pounds of silver and gold, equivalent to nearly $30 million today, bought Paris' survival, but it also broadcast a dangerous truth: the Franks would pay dearly to avoid confrontation. What if Ragnar had demanded double or insisted on permanent settlement rights along the Seine? The Vikings weren't just raiders, they were calculating opportunists. Had they carved out a Baltic-style trading hub in Paris' ashes, the Loire and Rhine would have become their personal highways, turning Francia into a patchwork of Norse enclaves. Consider the domino effect on Carolingian politics. Without Paris as a royal stronghold, rival factions like Lothaire's supporters might have seized the moment to fracture the empire decades earlier than our timeline's Treaty of Verdun. Local lords, seeing their king's weakness, could have turned to Viking mercenaries for protection, accelerating the very feudal fragmentation that took centuries to unfold. Picture a 9th century Europe where Norse jarls sat alongside Frankish counts in fractured courts, their war axes propped against the throne, yet the true ripple might have been cultural. Norse pantheon worship, already seeping into coastal settlements, could have taken root inland through a conquered Paris. Imagine Thor's hammer amulets dangling beside Christian crosses in marketplaces, or Eddic poetry recited in halls where Latin psalms once echoed. Over generations, this syncretism might have birthed a hybrid faith as distinct as the Celtic Christianity. It displaced one where baptisms happened in mead horns and Yule blended with Christmas. The Vikings' logistical brilliance often goes overlooked. Their shallow draft longships allowed rapid strikes far inland, while their use of captured Frankish horses enabled lightning-fast cavalry raids, a tactic they perfected in Ireland. Had Paris fallen, these innovations could have been institutionalized, creating a standing Norse-Frankish force more mobile than any medieval army. Future battles from Tours to Aachen might have seen shield walls bolstered by Viking-style hit-and-run tactics, rewriting European warfare centuries before gunpowder. As the smoke of this alternate siege of Paris clears, one truth emerges. Sometimes history pivots not on epic clashes, but on the weight of a chest of silver coins and the cunning of those who carry them away. Now picture a world where the echoes of Norse speech mingled with Old Frankish in the halls of power across Francia. Had Ragnar's Vikings established permanent footholds beyond their coastal raids, the very foundations of French identity might have unraveled and rewoven itself with Scandinavian threads. Let's trace how this cultural collision could have reshaped everything from legal codes to breakfast pastries. The most immediate shift would have been governance. Norse warlords didn't just conquer, they assimilated, as seen in Normandy just decades later. In this alternate timeline, Parisian jarls might have instituted things like the Thing, open-air assemblies where freemen debated laws under the shadow of raven banners. Carolingian bureaucracy, with its Latin charters and church-trained scribes, could have hybridized with Viking oral traditions, creating a legal system where sworn oaths held equal weight to parchment decrees. Picture Frankish kings needing to prove their worth through martial deeds like Sigurd the Dragon Slayer rather than papal coronations. Language would have been the next frontier of change. Modern French already carries traces of Viking influence. Words like equipper from Old Norse skipa, meaning to outfit a ship, snuck in through Norman channels. But with Norse settlers controlling the Seine basin, we might have seen Frankish dialects absorbing whole grammatical structures, not just vocabulary. Imagine French nouns adopting Norse-style suffixes, or the loss of grammatical gender under the Vikings' pragmatic speech patterns. Even today, Parisians might toast with "scal" instead of "votre santé," while bargaining at marché aux puces using numbers like "tio" for 10. Then there's exploration. Norse Francia wouldn't have stopped at European borders, it would have supercharged them. Viking navigators who discovered Iceland and Greenland did so from Scandinavian bases. With the wealth of the Seine at their disposal, Parisian shipwrights might have launched expeditions dwarfing Leif Erikson's. Picture Frankish Norse colonies blooming along the St. Lawrence River 300 years before Columbus, trading glass beads for furs with the Micmac people. The name Vinland could have become as familiar as Provence, with Paris serving as the continental hub for New World timber, pelts, and maybe even potatoes arriving centuries early. Cuisine tells its own tale, but a rich Norman cuisine exists because Vikings introduced dairy-intensive practices to northern France. In this timeline, smoked reindeer meat might have joined baguettes on Parisian tables, while fermented shark, that infamous Nordic delicacy, could have been the medieval equivalent of fast food. Even the humble kvass might never have risen to prominence, replaced by rye flour flatbreads baked on iron griddles like those found in Viking longhouses. The religious landscape would have been equally transformed. While the Norse eventually converted to Christianity, their early pantheon left marks wherever they settled. Thursday, Thor's Day, still dominates European calendars. In a Norse Francia, we might have seen cathedrals built over temples to Freyja, their spires carved with interlocking beast motifs instead of saints. Christmas could have become Jol year-round, blending Jesus' birth with the wild revelry of the Yule blot, where mead flowed freely in memory of Odin's sacrifices. What emerges isn't just a Francia with more blonde beards. It's a civilization where Charlemagne's heirs ruled by consent of both the Pope and the All-Father, where runestones dotted the Loire Valley, and where explorers hoisted sails embroidered with fleurs de lis and ravens alike. The weight of those 7,000 pounds of silver didn't just spare Paris, it preserved a version of Europe we'd barely recognize today. As we move from the Seine to the English Channel, another pivotal moment awaits, one where a single arrow's flight determined whether England would ever speak French. But that's a tale for next time. Now let's turn our gaze to the windswept cliffs of Hastings, where history teetered on the edge of an arrow's flight. Had King Harold II's Saxon shield wall held firm against William the Conqueror's Norman invaders, the very fabric of England would have woven a drastically different pattern. The stage was set on October 14, 1066, after Harold's forces marched nearly 200 miles in just 9 days to confront William's army. Exhaustion clung to the Saxon ranks like chainmail. Many had just fought a brutal battle against Norse invaders at Stamford Bridge. That fatigue proved fatal when the Normans feigned retreat, breaking the shield wall's discipline. But imagine if Harold's housecarls had resisted the ruse, or if William's cavalry had bogged down in the marshy terrain. A Saxon victory here wouldn't just mean survival, it would mean an England forever free from Norman yoke. Consider the arrow that allegedly struck Harold in the eye, a moment immortalized in the Bayeux Tapestry. In our alternate timeline, that missile glances harmlessly off a helmet crest. With their king unharmed, Saxon morale surges as dusk falls. William's mounted knights, already struggling against the uphill slope, find themselves outflanked by fresh feared levies wielding deadly two-handed axes. By morning, the Norman fleet burns in the Channel, and Duke William's body lies unidentified among the slain. No Hastings, no conquest, just a strengthened Anglo-Saxon kingdom facing the 11th century on its own terms. Language would be the first and most visible casualty of this change. Without Norman French dominating courts and castles, English retains its Germanic roots more stubbornly. Words like beef and pork never replace Old English coo and swin, leaving us with cow meat and swine flesh on modern menus. The elegant layers of Latin-derived vocabulary that give English its depth might never blend with Germanic simplicity, resulting in a tongue closer to Frisian than the global lingua franca we know today. Even Shakespeare's plays, if they existed at all, would sound like Beowulf to our ears. Land ownership tells another story. The Domesday Book, William's Great Census, never gets scribed, meaning Saxon thegns keep their estates rather than surrendering them to Norman lords. The feudal system, with its strict hierarchies, gives way to England's older communal traditions. Peasants might have retained rights to hunt in royal forests, and the concept of primogeniture never replaces Saxon customs of dividing land among all sons. Centuries later, this could butterfly away the Magna Carta, the War of the Roses, even the British Empire's colonial structures. Religion twists down an uncharted path too. Without Norman influence, the English Church resists Rome's tightening grip. Monasteries continue producing illuminated manuscripts in the Anglo-Saxon style rather than adopting continental Romanesque architecture. The Venerable Bede's legacy might have birthed a distinctly English Christianity centuries before Henry VIII's Reformation, one where vernacular sermons and married priests are the norm. Imagine pilgrimages to Canterbury honoring St. Alphege instead of Thomas Becket, with Mead Halls standing where Gothic cathedrals later rose. Military evolution takes a Saxon turn. The Norman preference for stone castles and armored cavalry gives way to England's traditional reliance on naval power and infantry. Saxon kings, remembering Viking raids, might have invested in coastal watchtowers and longship fleets rather than motte and bailey forts. The 100 Years' War could have become a North Sea Empire saga, with English longships harrying Baltic trade routes instead of archers raining death at Agincourt. Culinary traditions simmer differently too. Norman chefs introduced spices like pepper and cinnamon to English tables, along with dishes like blancmange. In our timeline, Anglo-Saxon staples, barley bread, honey-glazed vegetables, and roasted meats dominate. Tea might still arrive centuries later, but without French-inspired afternoon rituals, would the English even care for it? The full breakfast could feature oatcakes and smoked herring rather than bacon and eggs. The ripple extends to the New World. Without Norman administrative efficiency, England might never have centralized power enough to launch colonial ventures. No Plantagenets means no Angevin Empire, no War of the Roses, no Tudor dynasty to sponsor Cabot and Raleigh. North America could have remained the domain of Norse explorers and Dutch traders, with perhaps a few Saxon fishing villages dotting Newfoundland's coast. In this world, the tapestry of English identity hangs without its Norman threads, no chivalric romances, no Tower of London, no French phrases peppering royal decrees. Instead, we might have gotten a rugged, seafaring England more akin to Denmark, its sagas sung in mead halls rather than its laws written in Latin. The arrow that sealed William's fate didn't just kill a king, it shot England into an orbit we're still untangling today. But history's pendulum swings again as we journey east to where another empire's survival hinges on walls of stone and faith. The fate of Byzantium awaits. Now let's step into the fascinating world that might have been an England untouched by Norman rule, where Anglo-Saxon traditions shaped the nation's destiny. Without William the Conqueror's iron grip, English law would have taken a dramatically different path. The Saxon system of moots, where freemen gathered to settle disputes under local customs, would likely have endured rather than being replaced by Norman centralized courts. Imagine a legal landscape where Wessex's dooms, the laws of Alfred the Great, evolved into a common law system without French terminology creeping in. Words like jury and justice might never have entered the English lexicon, replaced by Old English terms like folkgemot for assemblies and dommage for judgments. The very concept of trial by combat, a Norman import, could have remained foreign, with oath helpers and ordeal by hot iron persisting as primary legal tools well into the Renaissance. Land ownership would tell an equally striking story. The Norman practice of primogeniture, where estates passed entirely to the eldest son, might never have displaced the Saxon tradition of gavelkind dividing land among all heirs. This single change could have altered England's entire social structure, preventing the rise of vast aristocratic estates and keeping wealth more evenly distributed. Thence, those Saxon warrior nobles might have evolved into a landed gentry with democratic leanings, their halls remaining centers of community governance rather than becoming satellites of Norman castles. Picture a parliament emerging not from royal councils of barons, but from revived White Age, mots assemblies of wise men advising kings on taxation and law. Language would pulse with a wholly different rhythm. Stripped of Norman French's influence, English might have resembled a sibling to Dutch or Old Norse rather than the romance-infused hybrid we know today. Nearly half our modern vocabulary words like government, noble, and art would either sound Germanic or not exist at all. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales could have been written in alliterative verse like Beowulf, and the great vowel shift might never have twisted Saxon vowels into their modern pronunciations. Even names would differ. Instead of William and Richard, England's kings might bear names like Ethelred and Wulfstan deep into the modern era. Religion, too, would wear an Anglo-Saxon face. Without Norman reforms, English churches might have retained married clergy and vernacular liturgy centuries before the Protestant Reformation. Monasteries like Lindisfarne, producing illuminated gospels in intricate insular style, could have remained Europe's artistic powerhouses rather than yielding to continental Romanesque trends. The cults of local saints like Cuthbert or Etheldreda might have rivaled Rome's authority, creating a distinctly English Christianity less tied to papal decrees. Picture pilgrimages to Glastonbury's Saxon shrines outshining Canterbury's Norman cathedral, with Bible translations appearing in Old English 300 years before Wycliffe. Military traditions would reflect this unbroken lineage. The Huscarls' two-handed axes and shield walls might have evolved into Renaissance-era infantry tactics, making England a land of foot soldiers rather than knights. Naval power, so central to Alfred's defense against Vikings, could have become England's primary force projection, longships giving way to early warships patrolling the North Sea. The famous English longbow, possibly a Welsh invention popularized by Norman kings, might never have dominated battlefields, leaving Europe's armies reliant on Saxon-style spear formations. Even daily life would simmer with difference. Anglo-Saxon diets rich in barley, oats, and honey would prevail over Norman imports like wheat bread and spiced wines. The full breakfast might feature oat cakes and smoked fish rather than bacon and eggs, while mead could have remained England's staple drink instead of beer. Social mobility, greater under Saxon custom, might have prevented the rigid class divides that shaped British society for centuries. The ripples extend globally. Without Norman administrative efficiency, England might never have centralized power enough to build an empire. The Tudor dynasty's naval expansion, the East India Company's trade networks, even the settlement of America, all hinge on governmental structures the Normans introduced. In this timeline, England could have remained a North Sea power, its influence lapping only at Scandinavia's shores rather than spanning oceans. Yet history chose the Norman path, threading French words through our speech, French arches through our skylines, French laws through our courts. But for one arrow's deflection, we might today be celebrating Ethelred the Persistent's millennium rather than William's conquest. Now, as we leave these Saxon shores, another empire's fate hangs in the balance where East meets West. The crumbling walls of Constantinople await our gaze. Shifting our gaze to the sun-scorched battlefields of the Holy Land, we arrive at one of the Crusade's most pivotal moments, the Battle of Hattin in 1187. Here, the legendary Saladin nearly faltered against the Crusader forces, and history teetered on the edge of a very different outcome. Picture this desperate struggle under the July heat. The Crusader army, led by King Guy of Lusignan, had marched toward Tiberias to relieve a besieged fortress, abandoning their strategic advantage near fresh water sources. This single decision set the stage for disaster. Saladin's forces controlled the wells along the route, deliberately denying the Crusaders access to water. As temperatures soared, knights and foot soldiers alike grew weak with thirst, their discipline crumbling. The Crusaders' heavy armor, usually their greatest asset, became a torturous burden under the unrelenting sun. By the time battle was joined, their formations were already in disarray. Now consider how differently events might have unfolded if the Crusaders had avoided this fatal mistake. Suppose King Guy had heeded wiser counsel and kept his forces near the springs of Sephoria. With ample water and secure supply lines, the Crusader heavy cavalry, the most formidable fighting force in the region, could have charged at full strength. Saladin's lighter troops relied on mobility and harassment tactics, but a well-organized charge by fresh knights might have shattered his lines. Had the Crusaders triumphed at Hattin, the Kingdom of Jerusalem could have endured for decades longer, maintaining Frankish control over key coastal cities like Acre and Tyre. The ripple effects of such a victory would have reshaped the Mediterranean world. Outremer, the Crusader states might have solidified into a permanent Christian stronghold, altering trade routes between Europe and the Levant. Italian merchant cities like Venice and Genoa, which thrived on supplying the Crusader states, would have grown even wealthier, potentially accelerating Europe's economic revival. Meanwhile, the flow of knowledge from Arab scholars to Europe, mathematics, medicine, and philosophy, might have increased under sustained Crusader rule, hastening the Renaissance. Religious dynamics would have shifted dramatically. A surviving Crusader kingdom could have forced prolonged negotiations between Christian and Muslim powers, possibly leading to earlier recognition of shared holy sites. The bitter legacy of the Crusades, which still echoes in modern conflicts, might have been softened by extended coexistence, yet history took the path we know. Saladin's victory at Hattin shattered the Crusader army, leading to the recapture of Jerusalem and the near collapse of Outremer. The Third Crusade, launched in response, became the stuff of legend, but it was too late to undo Hattin's consequences. As the dust settles on this crossroads of holy war, another battle beckons our attention, one where divine winds and wooden ships would decide the fate of an island nation. The Mongol fleets loom on the horizon, turning our attention to the lasting impacts of a Crusader victory at Hattin. Let's explore how a fortified Outremer could have reshaped the medieval world. Imagine a Middle East where Christian kingdoms stood firm, maintaining their grip on key coastal cities and trade hubs. The political and cultural landscape would have looked dramatically different, not just in the Levant but across Europe and Asia. With the Crusader states intact, Mediterranean trade routes would have flourished under Frankish control. Cities like Acre and Tyre, already bustling centers of commerce, would have grown even wealthier as gateways between East and West. Italian merchant republics, particularly Venice and Genoa, would have expanded their influence, funneling spices, silks, and other luxuries into Europe at an unprecedented rate. This economic boom might have accelerated the rise of banking and early capitalism, laying the groundwork for the Renaissance decades earlier than it actually unfolded. But trade wasn't the only thing that would have thrived. The Crusader states, perched at the crossroads of civilizations, could have become melting pots of knowledge. Arab scholars had already preserved and advanced Greek philosophy, medicine, and mathematics works that European scholars later rediscovered during the Renaissance. With stable Crusader rule, this exchange of ideas might have happened sooner and more systematically. Think of the lost possibilities. What if Leonardo da Vinci had access to Arabic engineering texts a century earlier? Or if medieval universities had incorporated Persian medical knowledge into their curricula while still in their infancy, religious dynamics would have been equally transformed. A prolonged Crusader presence in the Holy Land might have forced Muslim and Christian leaders into sustained diplomacy, whether through uneasy truces or formal treaties. Shared governance of Jerusalem, for example, could have established precedents for interfaith coexistence long before the modern era. The bitter legacy of the Crusades, often remembered as a clash of civilizations, might have softened into a more nuanced history of negotiation and cultural exchange. Yet history took a different path. Saladin's victory at Hattin didn't just erase the Crusader army, it set in motion a chain of events that reshaped the Middle East. Without a strong Christian foothold, the region's trade networks shifted, and Europe's rediscovery of classical knowledge had to wait. As we leave the dust of Hattin behind, we're drawn to another turning point, one where nature itself decided the fate of empires. Off the coast of Japan, a storm was brewing that would change history. Now we shift our gaze to the shores of medieval Japan, where the fate of an entire nation hinged on the whims of the weather. The Mongol invasions of Japan in 1274 and 1281 present one of history's most dramatic what-ifs. Twice the mighty Yuan dynasty launched massive naval assaults, and twice legendary typhoons, later called kamikaze or divine winds, scattered their fleets. But what if those storms had never arrived? Japan's fiercely independent culture might have been swallowed whole by Kublai Khan's empire, altering the course of Asian history forever. The Mongols had already conquered Korea and much of China, but their naval capabilities couldn't match their land dominance. Their invasion fleets, hastily constructed from captured Korean and Chinese ships, were overcrowded and poorly designed for open ocean warfare. Korean shipbuilders, forced to construct vessels under tight deadlines, produced unstable troop transports that couldn't withstand rough seas. Meanwhile, the Mongol signature tactic, mounted archery, was utterly useless aboard rocking ships. When they reached Japan's shores, their forces became sitting ducks for samurai defenders who knew every inch of the coastline. Even without the typhoons, the invasions were plagued by logistical nightmares. The first assault in 1274 saw Mongol troops stranded without reinforcements when their commanders inexplicably withdrew their reserve fleet. During the 1281 invasion, Japanese guerrilla tactics prevented the Mongols from establishing a beachhead. Their ships, anchored close together, became death traps when fire arrows set them ablaze. The so-called divine winds merely finished what poor planning had started. Had the Mongols succeeded, Japan's isolation would have shattered centuries early. The samurai class might have been absorbed into the Yuan military system, their Bushido code replaced by Mongol military doctrines. Shinto shrines could have been repurposed as Buddhist temples under Yuan patronage, mirroring changes seen in Tibet. Most significantly, Japan's later technological leaps, from matchlock firearms to Edo period urbanization, might never have occurred under Mongol rule. The very traits that later made Japan unique could have been smoothed into just another province of a vast continental empire. Yet nature intervened, leaving us to ponder how different East Asia might look today. As we move forward in time, another empire stands at the brink, not by sea, but at the crumbling walls of a legendary city. The final act of Byzantium awaits. Turning our attention to the long-term consequences, let's explore how Japan's cultural identity might have unraveled under prolonged Mongol domination. The samurai, the backbone of Japanese military tradition, would have faced the most dramatic transformation. Under Yuan rule, their strict Bushido code would likely have been replaced with the Mongols' meritocratic military system, where promotions were earned through battlefield performance rather than hereditary status. The katana might have disappeared entirely, replaced by Mongol composite bows and curved sabers, while mounted archery could have become Japan's primary combat style. Samurai rebellions would have been crushed with overwhelming force, eroding the warrior class's political influence centuries before the Meiji Restoration ended it. Religious life in Japan would have undergone equally profound changes. The Mongols, devout Tibetan Buddhists, would have patronized Buddhist temples at the expense of Shinto shrines. We might have seen sacred Shinto sites repurposed like those in Tibet, where local deities were reinterpreted as Buddhist protectors. The emperor, considered a divine figure in Shinto tradition, could have been reduced to a puppet like Japan's later shoguns, or worse, removed entirely like the Abbasid caliphs after the Mongol sack of Baghdad. This religious shift might have prevented the rise of later nationalist ideologies tied to Shinto, fundamentally altering Japan's 20th century militarism. Economically, Japan's industrialization could have taken a completely different path. The Mongols prioritized continental trade over maritime expansion, potentially stifling Japan's later shipbuilding innovations that enabled its 16th-century silver trade with Europe. Without isolation, Japan might have developed gunpowder weapons earlier, but mass production techniques crucial for 19th-century industrialization could have lagged without European contact. The Tokugawa shogunate's careful urban planning might never have emerged, leaving cities like Edo, modern Tokyo, without the infrastructure that supported rapid modernization. Even Japan's famous ceramics might have developed differently, as Yuan taste would have dictated production toward Chinese-style blue and white porcelain rather than traditional raku ware. Perhaps most strikingly, Japan's linguistic identity might have fractured. While the Mongols typically didn't impose their language on conquered peoples, Japanese could have absorbed significant Chinese and Mongolian loanwords, particularly in military and administrative contexts. The kanji writing system might have been simplified earlier under Yuan influence, or even replaced entirely with the Mongol Fagspa script as happened temporarily in Korea. This linguistic shift could have made 20th-century Japan far more integrated with mainland Asia, potentially changing its imperial ambitions, yet nature decreed otherwise. Those typhoons preserved Japan's cultural DNA at a critical moment, allowing traits we now consider quintessentially Japanese, from tea ceremonies to kendo, to develop independently. As we'll see next, another empire's fate hung in the balance just decades later, when cannons breached the mightiest walls Christendom had ever known. Now we shift our gaze to the mighty walls of Constantinople, where one of history's most defining sieges nearly turned out differently. Picture the year 1453 as the Byzantine Empire, reduced to little more than its legendary capital, makes its last stand against the rising Ottoman tide. The young and ambitious Mehmed II, just 21 years old, has thrown the full weight of his empire against the city, determined to achieve what his ancestors could not. But what if the Byzantines had managed to hold the line? What if the last remnants of Rome had survived this final assault? The odds were already stacked impossibly high. Constantinople's legendary walls, unbreached for over 1,000 years, were now facing the largest cannons the world had ever seen. Mehmed's massive bombard, capable of hurling stone balls weighing over 1,000 pounds, had shattered entire sections of the fortifications. Yet, even in their weakened state, the defenders fought with desperate ingenuity. Greek fire, the ancient Byzantine secret weapon, still spewed its terrifying flames onto Ottoman ships, but its effectiveness was limited by dwindling supplies. The Byzantines had fewer than 7,000 men to defend nearly 12 miles of walls, while Mehmed commanded over 80,000. But history could have pivoted on a handful of near misses. Imagine if the Byzantines had received the reinforcements they desperately hoped for. A Venetian fleet delayed by unfavorable winds might have arrived in time to break the Ottoman naval blockade. Or what if Mehmed's massive cannon had malfunctioned irreparably during the siege, denying the Ottomans their greatest advantage? Even a single well-timed sortie by the defenders could have disrupted the Ottoman siege lines at a critical moment. Emperor Constantine XI himself led daring counterattacks under cover of darkness. Had one of these raids succeeded in assassinating Mehmed, the entire campaign might have collapsed into chaos. A Byzantine victory here would have reshaped the Mediterranean world. Without control of Constantinople, the Ottomans would have struggled to dominate the Balkans or threaten Europe as they later did under Suleiman the Magnificent. Venice and Genoa might have retained their trading empires in the eastern Mediterranean, delaying the age of exploration that followed when European powers sought new routes to Asia. Most intriguingly, Byzantine scholars fleeing to Italy helped spark the Renaissance. Had their empire survived, this intellectual exodus might never have occurred, potentially delaying Europe's cultural rebirth by decades. Yet the real tragedy lies in the details. On the final day, a single unguarded gate left open by retreating defenders allowed the Ottomans to pour into the city. Had that gate remained sealed, or had the Byzantines mustered one last rally, the course of history might look very different. Instead, the last Roman emperor fell fighting in the streets, and Constantinople became Istanbul, marking the end of an era. But as we'll see next, even this seismic shift pales beside the wars that nearly rewrote the map of early modern Europe. Shifting our focus from the battlefield to the broader currents of history, let's explore the ripple effects of a Byzantine empire that somehow endured beyond 1453. A Constantinople still flying the double-headed eagle would have reshaped Europe's religious and political landscape in ways we can scarcely imagine. Consider the Reformation, which erupted just 64 years after Constantinople's fall. A surviving Byzantium with its deep-rooted Orthodox traditions might have presented a third force in Europe's religious upheaval. While the Catholic Church grappled with Luther's protests, the Byzantines could have offered an alternative Christian model, one not fractured by the Great Schism of 1054. Imagine Orthodox scholars debating Protestant thinkers, or Byzantine diplomats mediating between Rome and Wittenberg. The very geography of the Reformation might have shifted, with Orthodox influence tempering the spread of Protestantism into Slavic lands, potentially preventing the violent conflicts that later swept through Germany and France. Then there's the age of exploration, spurred in part by the Ottoman control of trade routes. Had Byzantine merchants still dominated the Bosphorus, the desperate search for new paths to Asia might never have reached its fever pitch. Would Columbus have sailed west if Genoa's traders could still access the Silk Road through a friendly Constantinople? The Byzantine navy, though diminished, might have partnered with Italian city-states to patrol the Mediterranean, keeping Ottoman corsairs at bay and preserving European access to Eastern goods. Portugal's voyages around Africa, driven by the need to bypass Ottoman territory, could have been delayed by decades, altering the colonization timelines of India and the Americas. But the most immediate impact would have been felt in the powder keg of the Balkans. With Byzantium as a buffer, the Ottoman advance into Europe might have stalled at the Danube. Hungary and Wallachia, shielded from direct Ottoman pressure, could have consolidated their power, preventing the centuries of conflict that followed. The Byzantines, ever the diplomats, might have brokered alliances between Slavic states, creating a united front against external threats. No Ottoman foothold in the Balkans could have meant no siege of Vienna in 1529, no Devshirme system drafting Christian boys into Janissary ranks, and perhaps even an earlier independence for Greece and Serbia. Yet the most tantalizing what-if lies in culture. The Renaissance owed much to Greek scholars fleeing Ottoman rule, but what if those intellectuals had remained in a thriving Constantinople? Byzantine universities might have become the epicenter of humanist thought, blending classical knowledge with Orthodox theology. The artistic exchange between East and West could have produced entirely new styles, with Byzantine mosaics inspiring Italian painters earlier than they did. Even the Enlightenment might have taken a different course, as Byzantine legal traditions rooted in Justinian's code offered alternative models to emerging European nation-states. Of course, survival wouldn't have meant stagnation. A resilient Byzantium would still face internal strife, palace coups, theological disputes, and the eternal struggle to balance imperial grandeur with empty coffers. But its mere existence would have forced Europe to reckon with a living remnant of Rome rather than a ghost. The continent's identity, so often defined in opposition to the Ottoman East, might instead have been shaped by dialogue with a Christian empire that never fell. As we'll see next, another clash of civilizations, this time in the snowy passes of Japan, nearly altered the course of global history in equally dramatic fashion. As we close this journey through history's turning points, let's take a moment to reflect on the incredible fragility of the world we know. From the Athenian stand at Marathon to the last desperate hours of Constantinople, every battle we've explored held the power to send civilization spiraling down an entirely different path. Just think, had a single arrow missed its mark, a storm arrived a day later, or a commander made a different choice, our modern landscape of nations, languages, and ideas might be unrecognizable. The ripple effects of these wars stretch far beyond their battlefields. A Persian victory at Gaugamela could have stifled the spread of Greek thought that later fueled the Renaissance. Hannibal's triumph at Cannae might have turned the Mediterranean into a Carthaginian lake, reshaping law, trade, and even the alphabet we use today. The kamikaze winds that saved Japan didn't just preserve samurai culture, they protected an isolation that would later influence everything from industrial policy to pop culture. Each outcome was a thread pulled from history's tapestry, leaving us to wonder what patterns might have emerged if those threads had been woven differently. This isn't just about military strategy, it's about the extraordinary contingency of human progress. The Reformation, the Enlightenment, even the Internet age all trace back to moments where history balanced on a knife's edge. Would Christianity have dominated Europe without Charles Martel's victory at Tours? Might we be speaking a Norse-influenced French if Paris had fallen to the Vikings? The questions are endless, and that's what makes them so thrilling. Now, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Which of these alternate outcomes do you think would have most dramatically reshaped our world? Would you rather live in a Carthaginian-ruled Europe, a Byzantine survival, or a Rome that conquered Germania? Drop your picks in the comments. We'll be reading every response. And if you've enjoyed this deep dive into history's crossroads, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Our channel is your gateway to more mind-bending explorations of how close we came to living in a completely different world. Until next time, keep questioning, keep imagining, and remember, the past wasn't inevitable. It was just one possibility among many.